In January 1888, a murder took place in London that shocked and intrigued Victorians in equal measure. It was brutal, it was horrific, and, just like the Jack the Ripper murders that took place later that year, it was destined to remain unsolved, although the police appear to have had one, possibly two, likely suspects in their sights. In this video, I'm going to outline the known facts about the awful crime, and since the perpetrator was never brought to justice, I'm going to ask you, the viewers, to decide, having heard all the surviving evidence, who you think might have been responsible. So join me as we make our way to George Street, Marylebone, a long thoroughfare that runs parallel with Marylebone Road and which crosses several major thoroughfares, including Baker Street, before terminating at Edgware Road. The scene of the crime was number 86, located on this section of George Street between Baker Street and Gloucester Place, although the actual house where the murder took place no longer exists, its site being occupied by the modern buildings on the left. However, the buildings opposite have survived, and since they're almost identical to the Victorian press images of the murder house, they give us a reasonable idea of what the property looked like. Lucy Clarke, the victim, was 49 years old at the time of her death, although those who knew her stated that she looked considerably younger. There were no images or photographs of her published at the time, so I've used descriptions of her that appeared in the newspapers to create what I think is a reasonable likeness. Neighbours remembered her as a tall and remarkably fine-looking woman who was possessed of a cheerful and generous disposition, although her manner was quiet and generally reserved. She was described by the Marylebone Mercury as having been tall and noticeable for her ladylike appearance. She had large and expressive eyes, and she wore her hair, which was long and of beautiful texture, coiled up in a fashionable style on top of her head. She had been born in Frome, Somerset, in 1839, and according to the penny illustrated paper, from a girl upwards she had been of industrious and thrifty habits, and in early life had learned dressmaking. On reaching adulthood, she had become a lady's maid and had worked in several aristocratic households, and over the years she had been gifted a number of valuable articles of jewellery, as well as other items and trinkets by her various mistresses, by all of whom, so the Mercury reported, she was greatly valued for her many excellent qualities. Her last employer was Lady Lonsdale, whose service she left in 1884 in order to set up in business as a dressmaker on her own account in London. At first, she lived with her widowed sister, Mrs. Chadwicks, at 78 Gloucester Street, Pimlico, fairly close to Victoria Station. Mrs. Chadwicks had 3 children living with her, 2 sons, Henry, aged 21, who worked for an architect in the City of London, and Walter, aged 19, who had been unemployed for several years. There was also a daughter, whose age was given by the newspapers as 20. Thanks to the contacts she had made during her years in service, Lucy's dressmaking skills were much in demand, although she was very particular about who she would do work for, an exclusivity that appealed to the snobbish aristocratic ladies of the age, and being able to charge a premium, her business flourished, enabling her to afford her own premises, and in late 1885 she moved to 86 George Street, where she occupied the 2 first-floor rooms, adorning them with the Dresden china, trinkets and ornaments that she had been gifted during her time in service. According to her neighbours, she took great pride in her appearance, was always well dressed, and was in the habit of wearing several rings, while her watch chain and pendants were generally to be found conspicuously displayed on the outside of her dress. Indeed, the consensus amongst those who knew her was that she might not have been wealthy, but it was more than evident that she was in comfortable circumstances. She was also a very religious woman, and she rented her own pew at the nearby Portman Chapel, which she attended every Sunday evening. Her landlord was Mr. R. Thomas, a tailor of 74 George Street. 86 consisted of 4 floors. As with the majority of the buildings in the street, the ground floor was a shop, which when Lucy Clarke moved in was occupied by Mr. Knott, a harness maker. His business, however, failed, and in September 1887 he vacated the premises, and the shop had remained empty ever since. The 2 upper floors had been occupied by another dressmaker by the name of Miss Gover. She moved out in November 1887, leaving Lucy and a beloved pet cat as the sole occupants of the premises. Mr. Thomas had tasked Mr. Holcombe, a letting agent of Orchard Street, with finding new tenants for the shop and upper floors, and a "To Be Let" sign was prominently displayed on the exterior of the building. Lucy's family were extremely uneasy about her living by herself, and one of her sisters, Mrs. Mees, had written to Mrs. Chadwick to express her concern. "Do try and persuade dear Lucy not to live in that house by herself, or else get someone to live with her, for I am so uneasy and do not consider it safe." Their greatest worry was occasioned by Lucy's constant habit of going out at night to purchase little things from nearby shops and leaving the door ajar. "We have all remonstrated with her many times on this one habit," Mrs. Chadwick would later recall, "and we have repeatedly told her how very dangerous it was for her, living alone in that big house with so many rooms empty, to go out and leave the door open the while." Lucy herself seems to have become worried about her own safety, as she had, so Mrs. Chadwick later recollected, come to them in great fright on several occasions, and had told them that she had had very little rest all the night because she had lain awake and heard noises, as though someone was endeavouring to force an entrance into the house, although she did not raise an alarm, as she was not quite sure. Interestingly, Mrs. Chadwick's statement about Lucy's state of mind during the last months of her life was contradicted by several neighbours, who told the Marylebone Mercury that Lucy was a powerful woman without the slightest sense of fear, and that she had ridiculed the idea of being afraid to live in the house alone. At some stage in the summer of 1887, Lucy had lost her front door keys and had been locked out, forcing her to spend a night with her good friend Mrs. Bridgestock, who, together with her husband, ran a coffee bar on nearby King Street. A locksmith had fitted a new lock the next day, albeit it would appear that no record of his identity was kept either by Miss Clarke or by the landlord. On Tuesday, January the 3rd, 1888, whilst visiting Mrs. Chadwick, Lucy had been taken ill with a severe cold, and, unable to return home, had stayed the night. Worried about her cat, she had asked her nephews, Walter and Henry, to go and feed it, and handed them her keys to let themselves in with. She returned home the next day and found that her drawers had been opened and some of her trinkets were missing. She immediately suspected that her nephews were responsible and had notified their mother of her suspicions. She complained of still having the cold on Sunday the 8th, when her brother Francis Clarke paid her a visit, and she also told him about her suspicions concerning her nephews. Aside from that, her brother later recalled, she seemed in good spirits, and she certainly wasn't that bothered by her nephew's behaviour. On the evening of Sunday the 15th of January, she attended the evening service at the Portman Chapel, after which she stopped off at Mr. and Mrs. Bridgestock's coffee house for a chat. Her nephew Henry Chadwick later claimed that he had visited her at around 9 p.m. on the night of Monday the 16th of January. He rang twice, he said, and when his aunt came down, he apologised to her for what he and his brother had done. She told him that she had written him a letter, but on finding the language in it a little stronger than she intended, she had decided not to send it. She then invited him in, but being ashamed of his behaviour towards her, he declined, whereupon she kissed him goodbye, and he left. That, he said, was the last time he had seen her alive. Nobody saw anything of her over the next few days, but since she was in the habit of going away to spend time with various relatives, sometimes for several weeks, none of her neighbours thought anything out of the ordinary about this. On Saturday the 21st of January, her brother Francis called to invite her to come and have dinner with him the next day at his house at 150 Walworth Road. Although he rang and knocked several times, there was no answer. Thinking she had gone out, he waited for 45 minutes and then scribbled her a note, which he pushed under the door. "My dearest Lou, I called tonight, Saturday, to ask you to be sure to come to dinner tomorrow. We shall be alone. I want a sister's advice. Yours, Frank." At 4:45 on the afternoon of Monday the 23rd of January, two ladies turned up at Mr. Holcomb's letting agency, expressing an interest in renting the shop at 86 George Street. Mr. Holcomb asked his clerk, William George Betts, to show them the premises, and the three of them made their way there. Going inside, Betts showed the ladies around the shop, and then left them whilst he went into the passage to pick up any posts that might be there. It was too dark for him to see anything clearly, and having picked up the letters, he turned to go back into the shop, when he noticed something lying across the floor at the foot of the stairs. Going closer, he saw that it was a woman, although he could only just make her out in the gloom. He went back into the shop to get some matches, and on returning, struck one. Immediately on doing so, he saw a large pool of blood on the floor around the woman. Rushing back into the shop, he ushered the women outside, told them not to go back inside, and then hurried to nearby Portman Square, where he found Police Constable James Grayston on fixed-point duty. Moments later, the two men were hurrying across the threshold of number 86 George Street, where Constable Grayston bent down and took hold of the woman's hand, and finding it to be cold, ascertained that she was dead. He and Betts then went to fetch a doctor, which proved quite difficult, as they called on 6, none of whom were in, before they finally found Dr. Times of 23 Manchester Street at home and brought him to the house where the body lay. Times later recalled that the deceased woman was lying in such a position that she could not be seen from the front door. The body lay across the passage, with the head hanging over the top step of the stairs leading down to the basement. There was, he said, a great deal of blood across the passage, and a trail of blood led to the street door. Crouching down over the body, he pronounced life extinct, and feeling her hands, told the police officer that she had probably been dead for 3 or 4 days. Grayston asked him what the cause of death had been, and the doctor replied that it was probably by the breaking of a blood vessel. However, on looking closer, he saw that the back of her head had been smashed in. Another constable then arrived, and Grayston sent him to fetch Chief Inspector George Robson from Marylebone Lane Police Station. Whilst they waited, Grayston and Dr. Times went upstairs, where they found the sitting room in order, although an empty jewel case and a watch case lay on the floor. The bedroom, however, had been ransacked, the drawers had all been opened and completely turned out. Soon Chief Inspector Robson, along with Dr. Spurgeon, the divisional police surgeon, had arrived at the scene. Spurgeon joined Dr. Times in examining the body, whilst Robson and several constables headed upstairs and commenced a search of the first-floor rooms. The two doctors both shared the opinion that she had been dead for some days. The injuries she had suffered were truly horrific, and it was evident that the majority of them had been inflicted whilst she was still alive. In addition to the terrible head injuries, which had fractured the skull into 5 pieces and had been done with a blow that was so hard that her hairpins had been bent by the force of it, her throat had been cut from ear to ear, the wound being so deep that it had nicked the vertebrae, which was notched. The doctors agreed that she had been alive when her throat had been cut, and that it must have been done while she was facing her killer, possibly while she was lying on the floor. The wound was not a clean one, and was quite jagged around the edges. She had extensive bruising to her arms and all over her head. It was evident that a ring had been violently wrenched from one of her right fingers, and since this was not found at the scene, it was probable that the killer had taken it away with him. Death, the doctors concluded, would have occurred moments after her throat was cut. The Marylebone Mercury went into graphic detail about the horror of her final moments. To all appearances, it is reasonable to believe that the lady was going upstairs when she was struck with some heavy instrument, similar to a jemmy, from behind, and was then pulled head downwards to the passage when her throat was cut to prevent her cries from being heard, she being only partially insensible. It is not possible to ascertain from the nature of the injuries whether the deceased was held by one man while another cut her throat, but it is considered not improbable, from the fact of her dress being much disarranged, that Miss Clarke was resisting an assault at the time she received the blow, rendering her partially unconscious. The blood spattered about on all sides shows that the poor woman was not rendered insensible at the first blow, as has been suggested, but that, violently resisting, grappled with her assailants, who, fearing discovery, committed the crime which they had never contemplated. As Times and Spurgeon went about their grim task at the foot of the stairs, Chief Inspector Robson and his fellow officers were combing through the upstairs rooms. The jewel case lying on the floor was empty, and had evidently been forced open, as the catch was torn away. As noted by Times and Grayston, the drawers had been turned out, and several little cases which had evidently contained jewellery were now empty. In one drawer, Robson found a letter addressed to Mr. Henry Chadwick, which was dated Saturday the 13th. It read, "Dear Harry, I am waiting an answer from you to know if it is your intention to pay for the damage you did my gold chain, and make good the things you have stolen from me. I have taken my chain to a jeweller's, and you have broken and twisted it so badly, and one piece you have broken off, so that he cannot mend it for less than 7 shillings and 6pence, and a double ring with loop of the quantity of gold will be 10 shillings. I think the action you did was that of a villain. You know I have the power to make you pay me one way or another, so you had much better let me know if you mean to do so of your own free will. Lucy Clarke." On the carpet in the front room, the searchers found 2 gold rings. Working their way down the stairs, they found some broken pieces of comb, of the type Lucy used to pin her hair up, in pools of congealed blood, along the passage and up the stairs leading to the first floor. Going through the letters that Betts had picked up, they found the note left by Frank Clarke, and a constable was dispatched to Walworth Road to fetch him to Marylebone Lane Police Station. By this time, Detective Inspector John Tunbridge of the Criminal Investigation Department at Scotland Yard had been sent to assist. He and Robson headed back to the police station, where they met with Frank Clarke. Having broken news of the murder to him, they asked if he knew of anyone who might want to harm Lucy, and told him that they were particularly interested in a Mr. Henry Chadwick, as it was evident that there had been some form of disagreement between him and the victim. Frank informed them that Henry was one of his and Lucy's nephews, and gave details of the theft from Lucy's rooms. Robson and Tunbridge promptly set off for 78 Gloucester Street to question them. They spoke first with Henry and asked him if he knew Miss Lucy Clarke. He replied that she was his aunt. Robson asked him if he had ever had any quarrel with her, and Henry said that he hadn't. "You never had a quarrel over some jewellery?" pressed the detective. "Surely she hasn't told you anything about that," was Henry's reply. He then admitted to Robson that when he and Walter had gone round to feed Lucy's cat, they had been quite drunk and had taken 2 gold bottle stoppers, which they had sold to a pawnbroker for 10 shillings. Whilst going through her possessions, they had managed to break a gold neck chain. His aunt had written to his mother to tell her what they had done, and he had gone round to see her on the night of Monday the 16th of January to apologise, and had promised to pay for the chain to be fixed. Robson now informed him that his aunt had been murdered and asked Walter to come in. Having searched and examined both the brothers' clothing, Robson took them to Marylebone Lane Police Station for questioning, whilst Tunbridge remained at the house, where he and several other detectives proceeded to search the premises, a search that yielded nothing that could implicate the brothers of any involvement in the crime. Robson and Tunbridge had fixed the date and time of the murder at some stage on the afternoon or early evening of Tuesday the 17th of January. Amongst the mail in the hall was an unopened letter from a customer dated the 21st of January, stating that she had called at number 86 the previous day, but could make no one hear her. Another letter, which must have been delivered late on the 17th, was also unopened, whereas one delivered on the morning of that day had been opened. The blinds in the first-floor room were drawn, and the bedroom shutters were closed, suggesting that the murder had taken place after dark. The victim was wearing her slippers, which looked new, and the soles were free from any mud or dirt, suggesting that she had settled in for the night when the murder occurred. At the police station, Robson therefore asked the Chadwick brothers to account for how they had spent their time from Monday the 16th up to the following Sunday. Henry stated that he had been at work every day until 6 p.m. and had then either gone straight home or had stopped off at the Warwick public house, where he generally met with his brother. Walter said that on Tuesday the 17th, the day on which the murder was believed to have been committed, he had been at home till 1 p.m. He had then gone to the Radical Club on High Street, Stratford, to see the manager, who was a friend of his, after which he had spent the rest of the day at the Manby Arms in Stratford. After several hours of questioning, the brothers were released, although they were, so the Marylebone Mercury reported, being closely watched by detectives. Convinced that the motive for the murder had been robbery, the police compiled an inventory of Lucy Clarke's missing property, which was circulated to all pawnbrokers and jewellers around London. The inquest into Lucy Clarke's death was held on the afternoon of Friday the 27th of January, with the coroner for Central Middlesex, Dr. Danford Thomas, presiding. Having heard from her brother Frank about their last meeting, and from William Betts about his finding of the body, the police and doctors gave their evidence. Inspector Tunbridge testified about the interviews with the Chadwick brothers and revealed that Walter's statement that he had gone to Stratford on the day of the murder, Tuesday the 17th, had been found to be incorrect, as inquiries had revealed that it was on Wednesday the 18th that he had gone there. The final 2 witnesses were the Chadwick brothers themselves, who were questioned at length. Walter said that he thought that it was on Tuesday that he had gone to Stratford, but it may have been on the Wednesday. He wasn't actually certain. They both strenuously denied any involvement in their aunt's death. With that, the coroner summed up. He began by telling the jury that Walter had not given a good account of himself. He observed that the robbery was evidently not the work of professional thieves, there being a banknote, gold and silver coins, and many expensive items left behind. A suspicion, he said, pointed to one or two who were not strangers to the deceased, and her own nephews acknowledged that they had been guilty of wronging her. With that, the jury retired to consider their verdict and returned shortly afterwards to say that it was one of willful murder against some person or persons unknown. The next day, the police were contacted by pawnbrokers Messrs George Attenborough and Son of 193 Fleet Street to report that a watch matching the description of one on the circulated list had been pawned at their establishment. Several members of Lucy Clarke's family were taken to the shop, and they pronounced the watch to be that which the dead woman had been in the habit of wearing on the outside of her dress. Consulting the records, the manager reported that it had been pledged at 11 o'clock on the morning of Wednesday, January the 18th, by a man who had given the name of Gill of St George's Road, southeast London. He had wanted an advance of 5 shillings on it, but had only been offered half that sum. This he refused, and was told the most they could offer was 3 shillings, which he accepted and left the shop. He was described as being between 20 and 30, very pale, dressed in a dark overcoat and wearing a high hat. On Saturday night, the Chadwick brothers were taken to Marylebone Road Police Station and placed in a line-up with a number of other men, and the shop manager, who had taken the pledge, was brought in and asked if he recognised any of those present as being the man who had pawned the watch. However, having scrutinised the 20 or so faces before him, he was unable to identify any of them as being the man who had done so. That same day, a representative from Lloyd's weekly newspaper had managed to secure an interview with the Chadwick family at their home. In his article, which was published the next day, he noted that Mrs. Chadwick was very ladylike and courteous in her demeanour, but showed traces of deep mental anguish. It was a terrible shock to her when she first had the information that her sister was dead, but when some time afterwards she heard that there was a belief that she had been murdered, the shock was more terrible still. Then, when one of her relations came and openly accused her own children of the murder of their aunt, she felt that she would never be able to bear up against the heavy trouble gathering round her. Of course, she said, her sons were taken by surprise and greatly angered. Then, when the detectives came and put the questions they did, she felt that she would be completely overwhelmed, and when they took them to the police station, all strength seemed to leave her. But, she said, I felt in my heart that they were innocent and that all would come right. The young men I knew did wrong in taking some of her valuables, but they had too much affection for their aunt to ever think of murdering her. No, the murderer or murderers must be sought for somewhere else. Walter and Henry were then interviewed by the reporter, and they were adamant that they had had no ill will against their aunt. On the contrary, they had a great affection for her, and she had forgiven them for the theft. They used to play chess with her when she came. In reply to a question which was put to them, they both stated that their belief was that whoever committed the murder must have got blood upon their clothes. Their clothes had been examined by the police and by the doctors microscopically, and though they wore the same clothes, not a spot of blood could be found. The house had been ransacked by the police, their linen had been inspected, and every inquiry had been asked of their laundry women to see if they had noticed any clothes spotted with blood. Despite the Chadwick brothers' protestations of innocence, it is evident that the police and many newspapers suspected that one or both of them were guilty of their aunt's murder, albeit the police were not actually sharing any information with the press, so what was appearing in the papers was coming from other sources, many of which were never actually specified. On the afternoon of Tuesday the 31st of January, several of Lucy's relatives went to her rooms with a view to removing her property. That evening, the Echo reported that, as soon as the premises were entered today, the deceased's cat, which was in the passage, was noticed to be perfectly wild, and no attempt was made to approach it. The poor animal has constantly remained on the spot where the body of its mistress was discovered, and at night, when the neighbours have listened at the front door, its piteous mews have been plainly heard. Miss Clarke was passionately devoted to the pet, but it is stated that such is its ferocious behaviour now that it will have to be killed. Over the next few weeks, Robson and Tunbridge pursued their investigations with what several newspapers described as even more zeal than at the outset, but their endeavours met with little success. Then, on the afternoon of Wednesday the 15th of February, a man went into the shop of William Page, pawnbroker, at 21 Borough Road, Southwark, with a piece of jewellery to have it tested. The metal proved to be gold, and the manager purchased it. That evening, the man returned and offered a gold chain and a pencil case for purchase or pledge. Examining the chain, the manager was struck by its similarity to a gold chain that was on the police list of items stolen from Lucy Clarke. He asked the man to come back in 10 minutes to give him time to test the metal, and to this the man agreed. Once the man had left the shop, the manager immediately sent word to the police, and 2 detectives from M Division hurried to the shop. When the man returned, he was arrested and taken to the police station for questioning. His name was John Dalton, and he told the police a very strange story. He was, he said, a rat catcher and beetle destroyer, and he had been working in the sewer running from the water closets of Victoria Station when he came across the items he had tried to pledge in the filth. It was evident, so the newspapers reported, that they had been flushed down one of the station toilets. Several newspapers reported that the police had searched the sewer and had found the other items of Miss Clarke's jewellery, with the result that all the missing articles had now been recovered. Lloyd's Weekly newspaper even sent a reporter to Victoria Station to interview the attendant at the toilets from whence the items had probably been flushed. He remembered that a little after 9 o'clock one evening, 3 or 4 weeks previously, a young man had come in and asked if he could clean his clothes. He had, he said, fallen off an omnibus, and he had mud and dirt on one side and the front of his jacket and trousers, a fact the attendant thought rather singular, as, in his opinion, if he had fallen off an omnibus, he would have rolled. But what struck him so particularly, Lloyd's reported, was some spots on his shirt-sleeve cuffs. He appeared more anxious to get those marks off than anything. He was not so much concerned about his clothes as these spots. He said he wanted to get them off particularly as he was going to a dinner, and he would not have had that occur on any account. The article continued, "The young man was very gentlemanly, cool and collected, but he was particularly struck with what he considered such loud, tall talk from what appeared to him a mere boy. After his clothes had been cleaned, he did not seem in any hurry to go, but at last the man got rid of him by telling him that if he did not go, he would be very late for dinner. He at the time thought it was very late for a young man to go to dinner." The proximity of Victoria Station and the sewer in which the jewellery was found to the Chadwick abode on Gloucester Street further strengthens suspicions against Henry and Walter Chadwick, and it is more than evident that a degree of trial by media was going on. The information being published certainly hadn't come from the police, a fact that Lloyd's newspaper made more than apparent in its original reporting of the finding of the jewellery. The police maintain strict reticence as to the progress they are making in unravelling the mystery surrounding the murder of Miss Clarke at 86 George Street now more than a month ago. In the neighbourhood where the tragedy took place, considerable anxiety was manifested by those who knew the deceased to ascertain the facts, and a strong opinion was expressed that the inquest had been too hastily closed. We thoroughly endorse this view and also share the belief that the modern system of police secrecy stands very greatly in the way of the detection of crime. And as it happens, the report of the find in the sewers may well have been fake news circa 1888. The Echo, on Saturday the 18th of February, disparaged the reports. The Marylebone tragedy. A false rumour. This morning, inquiries were made respecting the rumour that a knife and some articles of jewellery said to be Miss Clarke's had been found in a sewer at the London, Chatham and Dover portion of the Victoria terminus, leading to the inference that the murderer of Miss Lucy Clarke threw his booty down a lavatory at the station. Mr. Matthews, the station superintendent, assures us that so far as his knowledge goes, there is no truth in the report, nor is there the slightest ground for saying that a rat catcher who was alleged to have made the discovery had had permission to enter the sewers to carry on his calling. As a matter of fact, there are no sewers whatever under Victoria Station, only 9-inch pipes which carry off the water and refuse into the main sewers a considerable distance away. And with that, newspaper reporting on the murder of Lucy Clarke grew less and less, and by the end of March it was receiving no coverage at all. The police were no doubt making inquiries, but to all intents and purposes, the trail had gone cold. As mentioned, it is evident that the Chadwick brothers had been judged guilty of the crime by some of the newspapers, and their actions over the period of the murder certainly didn't do them any favours. However, the police most certainly would have investigated them thoroughly, and it is more than apparent that they entertained grave suspicions against them. The coroner, in his summing up at the inquest into Lucy's death, even went so far as to implicate the brothers directly, and yet they were never even arrested, let alone charged. So tempting as it is to dismiss the Victorian police as bumbling incompetents, who failed to bring to justice a murderer or murderers who were right under their noses, we have to conclude that if they couldn't find any evidence against the brothers, the reason has to have been that there was none to find. And as it transpired, the police hadn't heard the last of the Chadwick brothers. On Saturday the 30th of June, the following article appeared in the Marylebone Mercury. At Southwark Police Court on Thursday, a good-looking tall young fellow, well-dressed, who gave the name of Frederick Conyers, 24, but whose real name is believed to be Chadwick, and one of the nephews of the woman Clarke, who was murdered some months since at George Street, Marylebone, was charged with stealing a gold watch chain worth £13, the property of Messrs Straub and Hopting, jewellers, of Blackman Street, Borough. Shortly after 6 o'clock on Wednesday evening, the prisoner entered the prosecutor's shop and asked their assistants to show him some good gold chains, as he wished to purchase one for his intended brother-in-law. A number of articles were shown to him, and at last he arranged to call the next day. The prisoner was about to leave the shop when one of the chains shown him was missed. The assistant took hold of his hand and opened it. In the palm was a black glove, and underneath the missing chain. The police had their attention drawn to the prisoner by another tradesman who suspected him of having shortly before attempted the same kind of trick, and he was taken into custody after having earnestly begged to be forgiven. Inspector O'Day said the prisoner had called in a number of shops where he expressed his intention of purchasing a valuable chain, but left without doing so. When searched at the station, only 3 shillings and sixpence in cash was found on him, besides 8 pawn tickets, 3 of which related to jewellery, a cheque for £7 10 shillings payable at the Birkbeck Bank and signed Sidney Russell, some memoranda cards with the name of Charlie Chester on them, with the address 78 Gloucester Street, Warwick Square, and a summons signed by Mr. Jarman, coroner's officer, to attend the inquest on the body of the woman Clarke, addressed to Chadwick, a name mentioned prominently at the time in connection with the case. Mr. Shiel remanded the prisoner in custody. On Sunday the 1st of July, Reynolds's newspaper reported that both brothers were now in custody and Henry hadn't gone willingly. It will be remembered in connection with the murder of Miss Clarke, the dressmaker, in February last at her house in George Street, Marylebone, that the names of her 2 nephews, Chadwick, sons of her sister, came prominently into public view, as the deceased in a letter charged them with going to her house and stealing some trinkets, etc., and for a time their conduct was under the close observation of the police. They are now both in custody for stealing watch chains by means of a trick, as will be seen by the police reports, and the authorities are now actively engaged in tracing their conduct with respect to a very large number of larcenies. The younger brother was arrested on Wednesday night, and in consequence of what the detectives learned, Sergeants Ward and Harvey determined to arrest Henry Eugene Montague Chadwick on a charge of stealing a chain, and accordingly they kept observation on the house where both were lodging at 78 Gloucester Street, Warwick Square, Pimlico, and at 7:30 on Friday evening they saw him enter the house with another man, and they followed. Ward took hold of him and told him he answered the description of a man who had been guilty of many larcenies, and he was going to take him into custody. The prisoner became very violent and shouted, "You are not going to take me alive!" But after a desperate struggle, the officers were able to get him into a 4-wheeled cab. He quieted down in the vehicle, and on arriving at Borough Road, took a sandwich out of his pocket and said it was the last he would ever eat. It was noticed that he had something else in his hand, which was at his mouth. Ward took hold of it and found it was a vial containing laudanum, from which he had taken a quantity, which had a visible effect upon him, but Dr. Evans, the surgeon of the M Division, used restoratives and brought him round. He was searched, and there were found upon him over 100 pawn tickets relating to jewellery, plate and wearing apparel. Inspectors O'Day, Shaw and other officers of the Criminal Investigation Department are inquiring into the conduct of the young men, and insofar as robberies from jewellers' shops are concerned, there will be a number of charges against them. A strict watch is ordered to be kept over Henry. The Chadwicks' final court appearance was on Wednesday the 1st of August, when Henry pleaded guilty to 3 charges of larceny and Walter to 1. In mitigation, their counsel, Mr. Avery, told the court that the two young men were nephews of a lady named Clarke, who was brutally murdered in her own house in George Street, Portman Square, and her jewellery stolen. Her murderer or murderers have never been brought to justice. Suspicion fell upon her two nephews, who were watched by detectives for some weeks. Evidence, however, could not be found against them, and they were never charged. While they were under suspicion, they lost their situations, and that was the excuse they set up for falling into bad company and stealing watch chains. Henry was sentenced to 12 months hard labour and Walter to 6 months. Walter's name hit the headlines again in March 1891, by which time he had moved to Manchester and was living in Vine Street, Hume, with a dressmaker named Louisa Davies. At some stage in the summer of 1890, he told her that he had been involved in 2 murders in London. The first, he said, was that of 57-year-old Louisa Samuels, the wife of a dairyman, who had been murdered in her shop and home at 92 Bartholomew Road, Kentish Town, on the 11th of March 1887. Since a heavy iron safe had been taken from the premises, the motive was evidently robbery, and the police concluded that Mrs. Samuels had disturbed the thieves and had been hit over the back of the head by one of them, causing the injuries from which she later died. Walter also told Louisa that although he hadn't actually carried out the murder of his aunt, Lucy Clarke, he knew who had done it. Over the next 9 months, he repeated his claims about the murders to her several times. It appears that Walter was violent towards Louisa, and on Tuesday the 17th of March 1891 she had gone to Manchester City Court to take out a summons against him for assault. She mentioned his claims about the murders to the police, and so Inspector Caminada had gone round to the house and arrested Walter and charged him with having been concerned in the murder of Mrs. Samuels. He also told him that he was charging him with being involved in the murder of Lucy Clarke. In answer to the charges, Walter replied, "Very well, I can't help it." He was taken to the police station and word was sent to Scotland Yard. That evening, Inspector Jarvis of the Criminal Investigation Department arrived in Manchester, and the next morning he was present in court when Walter Frederick Chadwick appeared before Magistrate Mr. J. Headlam on a charge of being concerned in 2 murder cases. According to the Portsmouth Evening News, the prisoner was dressed in a fashionable suit of clothes, is a good-looking fellow, and is about 28 years of age. He listened very attentively to the evidence, and beyond one exception, conducted himself calmly. He evidently appreciated the gravity of the charge made against him. The exception that the news referred to occurred when Louisa Davies was giving evidence and was talking about his confession. Walter had interrupted to ask the magistrate in a loud voice, "Do you, sir, think any man in his right senses would make such a statement as that to a woman of the witness's character?" Mr. Headlam told him that that was a question for a jury to decide. Turning to Louisa, Walter asked, "If you knew a man on his own confession to be a murderer, why did you live with him, and why did you not tell the police before?" "Because I was afraid. I have been in danger of my life," was Louisa's reply. Walter was remanded for a week. It appeared that justice was about to be served for not just 1 but 2 unsolved murders in London. But, as had so often been the case with the brothers Chadwick, things didn't quite work out that way. On Thursday the 26th of March, Walter again appeared before the Manchester magistrates, and the Sheffield Evening Telegraph reported that Detective Inspector Caminada now stated that since the accused was last before the court, the Chief Constable had received a communication from the London police, as a result of which he did not propose to proceed further with the case against the prisoner. The magistrates accordingly discharged the prisoner. And so Walter Chadwick walked free from court and thereafter faded into obscurity. The murder of Lucy Clarke remained unsolved, as did that of Mrs. Samuels the year before. Over and over again whilst researching this video, I found myself baffled by the police's seeming reluctance to actually charge the brothers. They seemed to be almost disinterested in solving the crime. I can't believe that the police didn't question the brothers again when they were arrested for larceny in the summer of 1888, and they must have been subjected to a rigorous grilling when Walter supposedly confessed to his involvement in 1891. Yet, aside from sending a member of the Criminal Investigation Department to Manchester to watch the case on their behalf, the Metropolitan Police appear to have done very little. There must have been something going on behind the scenes, and yet, sadly, we are destined to never know what it was. The evidence we have appears to point overwhelmingly towards the Chadwick brothers' guilt, and yet they just seem to have been impervious to any accusations that were thrown at them. Anyway, you've heard all the evidence, so please let me know what you think in the comments section below. Perhaps you spotted something that I've missed. Thanks for watching, and until my next true crime tale, stay safe.